Okay, let me welcome everyone to today's Cold War Studies seminar from the University. My name is Mark Kramer. I'm Director of Cold War Studies, and I am very pleased to welcome here Wolfgang Müller from Austria, who had been at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, but now for the past several years has been a professor of modern European history at the University of Vienna, and with particularly on the former Soviet Union. He has written extensively about the topic of today's seminar, including a book that came out a few years ago in English on the subject. He has written deal in English as well as in German. And I am very pleased to welcome him in addressing a topic that is not only of interest historically during the Cold War, but also becoming increasingly relevant today. So with that, let me turn to Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. A warm welcome also from my side. It's certainly a great honor for me to be here among you in this series, and I am very much looking forward to the talk and also to the discussion afterward. We are certainly meeting at a historic moment, a time where political decisions are going to be taken that may shape the international relations for many years to come in the future. All of you are aware of the Trump presidency having jump-started US-Russian relations. Whether this is also going to make a contribution to ending the Russian aggression against Ukraine still remains to be seen. However, you all also know that the topic of neutrality and neutralization has been also part of many statements that President Trump has made with regard to the future of Ukraine. And in fact, it has been a long-standing Russian demand with regard to Ukraine. This very often lets us forget that Ukraine has already some tradition of neutrality, that Ukraine, in fact, was neutral when it was attacked the first time in 2014 by the Russian Federation. There are some who even argue that Russian aggression, both in 2014 and in 2022, was possible because Ukraine was neutral in 2014 or non-aligned, if you wish, and it still was no member of the Western Alliance in 2022. So certainly neutrality, neutralization, non-alignment, these are factors that in some specific situations are weakening the country that has declared neutrality, and this certainly plays a role, I believe, in the Russian strategy. And however, this is no new phenomenon. It also played a huge role in the Soviet strategy with regard to spreading neutrality in Cold War Europe, and about the differences and also the similarities between the Russian approach toward neutrality today and the Soviet approach in the past. I will talk over the next half hour or 40 minutes. The fact that neutrality is in specific situations a weakening factor certainly has contributed to perhaps the most profound change that happened in the European security architecture in the past 2 years. And this is Finland and Sweden abandoning their traditional policies of neutrality and joining the North Atlantic Alliance. This step has been expected by experts And it also reflects the traditional Scandinavian understanding of non-alignment or neutrality as a pragmatic instrument in an entangled security environment, as it was expressed already in the Cold War Nordic balance. But as I said, how does the Russian war against Ukraine affect the neutrality of other European nations? How is this perceived by the Kremlin, and how does it deviate from or dovetail with earlier Soviet policies towards neutrals? In my talk, I will start with the current situation, then turn to the Cold War, and finally draw some conclusions. Let us begin with the general observation that the Scandinavian reaction of giving up neutrality was far from universal among European neutrals. Here we see the foreign ministers of Finland and Sweden, and we also see how quickly the public opinion in both countries changed with regard to traditional neutrality on the one hand, and then alliance membership. You see here the comparison between 2017 and 2022, when in both countries there was a surge of supporters for NATO membership. However, despite some debate and the general commitment toward increased defense spending, other neutral countries have not abandoned their traditional status. For instance, Irish elites and society remain reluctant about questioning their country's neutral status. In Austria, the then Chancellor Karl Nehammer, who was fighting an uphill battle against the radical right-wing Freedom Party in the past 2 years, explicitly ruled out a political debate about neutrality at all, fearing that neutrality-loving Austrians would punish those who were questioning the country's traditional status in the upcoming elections. Although Austria's neutrality, which was adopted in 1955 as the price for Soviet withdrawal from the country after World War II, is relatively young, for instance, in comparison to Swiss or Swedish neutrality, both of which are coming or dating back to the 19th century. But also Austrian neutrality is highly popular among the Austrian population, with approval ratings consistently above 80%, thereby exceeding even the Irish approval ratings for neutrality by some 20 points. Irish and Austrian policy also are by and large determined by the European Union's foreign and security policy, which is also inscribed in the Austrian constitution and usually trumps neutrality, the principle of neutrality. This, however, is not the case with Switzerland, which is no member of the European Union, as you know. After some hesitation, Switzerland also joined EU sanctions against Russia in 2022, albeit with some loopholes included. The Swiss also agreed to return some tanks to Germany when it came to sending ammunition to Ukraine. However, the Swiss proved to be very reluctant. In addition, an initiative was launched in Switzerland to inscribe neutrality, whose popularity is usually around 90%, into the Swiss constitution. At the same time, however, advocacy for NATO membership increased up to 31%. As contradictory this may seem, slightly more than 50% of the Swiss population agree that the country should have close ties with NATO. While none of these debates are anywhere close to affecting the strategic balance in Europe, the changes in the hitherto neutral north, bordering Russia's northwestern flank, are likely to be significant. They include or will include the creation and deployment of additional defense, deterrence, and counterstrike capabilities, such as airfields and missiles. As Al Jazeera reported, and I quote, Finland's membership in NATO particularly leaves Murmansk, the naval base of the Russian northern fleets in the Barents Sea and possibly also the White Sea, vulnerable. Since all of this was more or less foreseeable as a possible side effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it calls even more into question the thesis that this war had anything to do with Russian concern over a much less likely NATO accession of Ukraine. The Russian reaction to the Finnish and Swedish decisions to join NATO was negative but muted, as two commentators in the Texas National Security Review put it. While Russian resources are currently obviously concentrated in the war against Ukraine and appear to be overstretched in any case, Vladimir Putin's announcement of the creation of the Leningrad district points to military countermeasures. This is not to say that neutral Finland or Sweden would have been exempt from Russian covert activities, as the Austrian example shows. In the end, both NATO members as well as neutral Austria became targets of hybrid assaults, such as the disruption of undersea cables, the blowing up or blocking of railroads, and the political channeling of migrants to European borders, as this happened in the cases of Sweden and Finland, or the relatively limited cyber attacks on the eve of last year's Austrian general elections. What seems to be more surprising are the rather disparaging assessments of Austrian and Swiss policy by Russian officials. This disapproval was made very clear by Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesperson, when she criticized that both countries had given up neutrality in the current war. And I quote, "We regret that literally before our eyes, in recent years, such countries as Austria and Switzerland have forgotten the glorious traditions of neutrality in favor of unobvious and misunderstood short-term interests in the context of the Ukrainian crisis." It's a statement from 2023, the crisis. They have thrown away the chance to act as mediators in the search for solutions to the pressing challenges of our time, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson said at a news conference. At the same time, she stressed that Russia had great respect for the policy of genuine neutrality. Looking at such current Russian statements more closely, they seem to be surprisingly consistent with Soviet Cold War policy. This brings us to the second part of my talk. How did the post-war USSR come up with neutrality, and how did it try to promote it and make use of it in Western Europe? To be sure, the USSR had already promoted and signed neutrality agreements in the 1920s with some of its neighboring states in an effort to increase Soviet security by neutralizing its immediate surroundings. After World War II, however, this idea developed into something more grandiose. Soon after the founding of NATO in 1949, and in the context of the Soviet struggle against the emergence of the European defense community, neutrality started to be promoted by the Kremlin and the Communist parties as a tool for preventing Western states from joining these Western blocs. So we see already the factor of weakening the other side being part of the entire rationale of neutralizing other states. This weakening would apply now from the Soviet perspective onto two opponents or possible opponents. On the one hand, to the Western alliance, which was deprived of potential future members that were rather neutralized, and then certainly also onto the neutrals who were prevented from being protected by the Western alliance. This campaign reached a first peak with Stalin's proposal of March 1952, which offered the reunification of Germany at the price of the country's neutralization. We do not know exactly whether these proposals were sincere. However, there is a very broad consensus among scholars that this was rather a propaganda campaign. However, soon after taking supreme power in the Kremlin in 1955, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader, decided to put the strategy of neutralizing Western states to the test by promoting Austria's permanent neutrality as the price for the Soviet withdrawal from that country. This was agreed upon in April 55. In May, then the state treaty was signed. You see here the ceremony where the treaty was presented. It was signed by the four powers, the four victorious powers of World War II, the four great powers who had remained in Austria for 10 years as part of an Allied control commission, and they joined together with Austria to sign this state treaty, reinstating the full sovereignty to this country. Only a few months later, in October, the Austrian law of neutrality was adopted. So there is no legal link between these two things. There is only a political link. The Austrian adoption of neutrality is a national law. It's a constitutional law, and Austria is certainly free to change this law. And that is why this construction was insisted upon by U.S. diplomacy, but also by the Austrians, that Austria would not be neutralized by the four powers, since this would have given them a say in how Austria would interpret its neutrality. From this point until the mid-1960s, the Soviet strategy consisted of two elements with regard to neutrality and the neutrals. Element number one was the promotion of permanent neutrality among Western nations. We see how this is applied not only to Austria, but then also, for instance, when the prime ministers of Norway and Denmark visit Moscow, and these countries were members of NATO at this time already, they were given the suggestion by Nikita Khrushchev of making their countries a neutral zone. Iceland, also NATO member, was offered a Soviet guarantee if it chose to expel US forces and declare itself neutral. And in the following years, the Soviet Union also promoted the adoption of neutralities by West Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Japan. During the Berlin crisis of the late 1950s until 1961 and following, Nikita Khrushchev suggested neutralizing West Berlin and replacing the Western garrisons, so the US, British, and French forces, with armed forces from the neutral countries. Again, thus aiming at weakening West Berlin's defense and flattering the self-esteem of the neutrals. This brings me to the second main goal of the Soviet neutralization strategy, which was to shape the Western understanding and interpretation of permanent neutrality in a way that would help to promote Soviet policy goals. In Soviet eyes, ideologically speaking, neutrality was more progressive than the Western system, which was usually called in Soviet terminology capitalism, but it was less progressive than socialism. By means of ever closer political, economic, and cultural cooperation with the Eastern Bloc, however, neutrals were expected to gravitate towards the Eastern Bloc and toward the Soviet Union. For a socialist state, however, permanent neutrality was not deemed a fit conditions. Condition. And that certainly was demonstrated when the USSR, for instance, disregarded a Hungarian declaration of neutrality that was made during the Hungarian uprising in the autumn of 1956. With regard to the rights and duties of permanent neutrals in peacetime, Soviet lawyers took on the task of formulating a set of rules for the neutrals that reflected the Soviet interest in turning permanent neutrality into a useful tool for promoting Soviet policy aims. In general, the Soviet theory of neutrality called upon neutrals to establish friendly relations with all states. Soviet lawyers claimed that neutrals had, for instance, to recognize the GDR, so Communist East Germany, and also the People's Republic of China, at a time when this was far from being a universal phenomenon, when many Western states did not maintain relations to these two countries. Soviet lawyers also called upon neutrals to maintain economic equidistance between the two blocs and not participate in economic sanctions, in Western economic sanctions and boycott against the East. Moreover, neutrals were repeatedly pressed by Soviet diplomacy to condemn certain measures of US policy, most notably the US intervention in the Vietnam War, or in general, the stationing of US troops on foreign soil. The question of whether neutrals were allowed or had to defend themselves in the case of war was not unanimously answered by Soviet scholars. And this is perhaps one of the most significant differences between the Soviet theory and the general Western interpretation of neutrality. Classical Western interpretation of neutrality usually uh, demands that the neutral has to defend himself or its the own country. It has to deny their own territory to any belligerent country. Otherwise, it loses neutrality. And this was, however, not at the core of these Soviet principles. So there are Soviet scholars who said, well, the neutrals, they need not necessarily defend themselves. However, unanimity existed among Soviet scholars regarding the demand that neutral armies be moderate, or rather weak in size, and claimed that, for instance, the Swedish and the Swiss armies clearly exceeded such dimensions. When Switzerland and Sweden in the late 1950s and early 1960s considered introducing a program for nuclear defense, both countries were fiercely attacked via Soviet propaganda. If a neutral country lived up to Soviet expectations, it was highly praised. uh, and by the Soviet side, and it was rewarded. For instance, here we see the two blocks, and here in gray we see the neutral countries in between. Austria, as it was neutralized in 1955, Sweden and Switzerland, which were quite often addressed by Soviet policy, Finland, whose neutrality was also recognized by the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev. And here we see Khrushchev visiting the Austrian Chancellor Julius Raab during a bilateral visit to Vienna. He also handed over as a gift a small model of a Sputnik. So obviously he was very talented in promoting, or in making his point. So in promoting the idea also how the Soviet Union advanced technologically. Uh, the Soviet attitude toward Austria is a function of this Soviet attempt in making more Western countries neutral, and also making the neutrals more Soviet friendly, if you wish. And as I said, if the neutral country behaved in the way the Soviet Union wanted that it would behave, then it was highly praised. If the Soviet side wished to persuade a neutral country to take certain steps, then the Soviet side would claim that neutrality obliged the country to do this. So neutrality was used as a lever or as a tool to persuade neutral countries to uh, fulfill certain wishes. If the neutral, however, did not fulfill Soviet expectations, it was criticized for not living up to its obligations as a neutral and was threatened with negative consequences, for instance, withdrawing of the recognition of neutrality. Since neutrality was portrayed as desirable, undesired actions by neutral states were branded as being at odds with neutrality. Therefore, it was stated that neutrality did not allow neutral countries to do what the USSR did not want them to do. The Soviet campaign for neutrality reached its apex in the 1960s, and most likely due to the dangerous attraction neutrality might have had on Central European countries in the Eastern Bloc, such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, it was downgraded under Leonid Brezhnev after 1968. The Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia and that in Hungary 12 years earlier demonstrated that neutrality did not automatically mean territorial inviolability. The Soviet Air Force and the USSR, as I said before, did not only disregard the Hungarian Declaration of Neutrality in 1956, but the Soviet Air Force also repeatedly violated Austrian airspace in both crises. And that's also something that we see in Scandinavia, even later on until the early 1980s, when Swedish territorial waters were repeatedly a target of Soviet naval intrusions by Soviet submarines in, for instance, the so-called whiskey on the rocks crisis. Now let us come back to the post-Cold War situation. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and later the USSR significantly reduced international tension, but also attention for Western permanent neutrality. Sweden, Finland, and Austria joined the European Union in 1995. Ireland had already done so 20 years earlier without provoking significant Soviet or Russian countermeasures. In many of these countries, and even in Switzerland, debates occurred at some point whether neutrality was still an appropriate strategy. While analysts often concluded that membership in the Western Alliance would have much better contributed to national security, they also found out that neutrality was preferred by large majorities of the population for psychological, nostalgic, ideological, or cultural reasons of national identity. In Austria, for example, the grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives in the 1980s therefore could not agree on a new national security strategy. This did not question the joint commitment to Austria's participation in the European security and defense policy despite neutrality. Since then, the Austrian constitution, for instance, has allowed for all measures of European security and defense policy, even if they contradict classical wartime neutrality. The only exceptions are alliance membership and foreign military bases on Austrian soil, which are still explicitly ruled out by the neutrality law. The Austrian security doctrine, adopted by a coalition of the Conservative People's Party and the right-wing Freedom Party in 2001, even described the country not as neutral, but as non-aligned. However, since then, the Freedom Party, which for some time had even advocated NATO membership, later presented itself as a promoter of an increasingly pro-Russian and otherwise rather isolationist neutralism. In the end, none of the Western permanent neutrals decided to join NATO before the Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the years before, new members of the Western Alliance had come from the Central and Southeastern European countries, as you can see on the map here with all the new member states of NATO from Central Europe and even from the Baltics. Yet, despite most Central European states joining NATO in the end, permanent neutrality and non-alignment did not disappear entirely, as for instance Belarus and Ukraine joined the group of non-aligned countries. From the Russian perspective, no specific strategy of promoting neutrality in Europe was discernible until the large-scale invasion of 22. When, for instance, in 2018, Austria's pro-Kremlin right-wing Foreign Minister Karin Kneißl proposed an Austrian mediation for the war in Syria at a press conference. This was rejected by her Russian colleague Sergei Lavrov. Similarly, the conservative Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer, who traveled in a quite remarkable attempt of shuttle diplomacy to Kiev and to Moscow in 2022 after the outbreak of the war, after the Russian invasion. He was also rejected in his attempt to mediate. Ukraine, as I have mentioned already, was the most obvious case of neutrality being proposed, if not demanded, by the Russian side at this time. Non-alignment had been included in many Ukrainian declarations since the Declaration of Independence, and it was then observed by and large until it was increasingly questioned under the Yushchenko administration. However, it was afterward inscribed into the legal corpus of Ukraine as a law. There was a law of neutrality, which was only abandoned at the end of 2014 after the beginning of a Russian aggression. Today's Russian war against Ukraine is somehow reminiscent of Stalinist policies toward Finland, in that it also combined first a war of aggression, second Russian annexations, and lastly the attempt, and in the Finnish case, the successful attempt at the neutralization of a neighbor. Russian aggression against Ukraine since 2014 has provoked various reactions. While Ukraine gave up non-alignment in December 2014 and Sweden and Finland did so in 2022, a survey in Switzerland and Austria in the same year showed that majorities of 71% in each country considered national security to be best protected by neutrality, a claim that has been falsified by history many times in the 20th and 21st century. Think about Belgium in World War I, or most recently about Ukraine in 2014. In the case of Central European NATO members such as Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, Russian media warfare has contributed to significantly strengthening so-called neutralist tendencies as we can see here on this slide. Here we see the results of opinion polls from all EU member states. This is a Eurobarometer poll from October, November 22, and we see here the response to or the support for financing the purchase and supply of military equipment to Ukraine. And we see that it varies considerably between countries. In green and light green, you have support, and in pink and dark, you see the rejection of such members. And we see that support is strongest among the previously neutral Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Finland, here on the slide to the left, followed by Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal and Poland, and then already the Baltic countries, but also Ireland. Then you see Austria in the middle, that's marked with the red arrow. The red arrow, this is pointing to Austria, where a small majority of 52% support the purchases of supply of military equipment to Ukraine with European funds, EU funds. However, you see that in NATO members in Central Europe that have been targeted by well, most likely Russian political communication and social media campaigns, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Slovakia, and Slovenia, we see that the majority is against such measures. This is what I mean, that these populations are displaying a significantly more neutralist attitude. So neutralist always referring to ideological neutrality, to ideological to a neutrality in questions of even of international law, which is not part of classical Western understanding of neutrality. So we see these neutralist tendencies spreading here, but this does not only affect Central European countries. We also see here Greece and Bulgaria and Cyprus obviously also being very reluctant. This certainly also has something to do with certain discourses, also with the closeness of in the case of Greece and Cyprus, of orthodoxy, with many pro-Kremlin narratives being promoted here, and most likely also with the strength of the Russian economic element, for instance, in Cyprus. As other polls repeatedly show, many Europeans still have high expectations regarding the ability of neutral states to bring peace to the world and to prevent wars. Such hopes, however, have proven unfounded. Still, they were nourished by the Russian or by the Soviet narrative in the Cold War, and most recently by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson in her already quoted comments on Switzerland and Austria last year, or I should say now already 2 years ago. And I quote again, Zakharova said, neutral nations have a great opportunity to act as mediators in conflict resolution. End quote. Now we see that, at least from the Austrian side, two significant offers to mediate have been rejected by Russia in 2018 and in 2022. So what conclusions can be drawn from the development of neutrality in Europe in general and in the Soviet and or Russian attitude toward it in particular? During the Cold War, Soviet policy used the promotion and shaping of neutrality to undermine the West and make neutrals more susceptible to Soviet wishes. This strategy was applied with different intensity, mostly between 1950 and 1968, less so in the 1970s and after Perestroika. After having lost interest in neutrality among Western states in the 1990s, Russian diplomacy seems to have rediscovered it. Maria Zakharova's statements sound reminiscent of similar Soviet declarations from the 1960s that promoted neutrality and disarmament in the West while criticizing Western neutrals if they did not behave in the way the Kremlin wanted them to behave. Today, Russian allusions to so-called true neutrality can be understood as one among many tools for undermining a coordinated Western response to the challenges posed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and hybrid warfare against the West. Other similarities between the time today and also the Cold War is that increased East-West tension has been conducive to strengthening the Western alliance and diminishing the importance of neutrality. Also, something that is quite similar is that neutrality in the Russian strategy is used as a tool for weakening, two addressees, both the neutralized country and also the Western alliance. What has significantly changed since the 1960s, however, is the security environment, in particular with regard to European integration, which has allowed and continues to allow small countries like Finland and Sweden to make their own security choices, or at least to stand the ground better than if they were relying only on their own resources. With regard to Ukraine, it remains to be seen whether neutrality or neutralization is going to be part of any solution for the future. However, it also needs to be kept in mind that any solution without a strong and reliable security guarantee for Ukraine will result in a weakening, not only for Ukraine, but of the West in general, and will certainly have serious consequences. Again, not only for Ukraine, but also for the West and for global security. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to debate.
Okay. Puts into historical perspective some of the issues that that are arising in a very different context, as you mentioned. There are some similarities, but also extremely important differences. So let me just raise a couple of questions. One will be during the Cold War, even though the neutral countries were neutral, is known now and was known even during the Cold War that some of them were having informal contacts with NATO, particularly the United States. And in wartime, expecting, or at least there was the implicit view that they would, if they came under attack, be defended by NATO, particularly again in Britain. Um, so nowadays, in thinking about Ukraine, Ukraine obviously has extensive contacts with NATO countries, has been receiving weapons and support. But the basic problem is that credible commitment to come to Ukraine's defense if it is, if it once again faces Russian aggression, which it undoubtedly there is not a firm security guarantee. That is an Article 5 type security guarantee. So, how do you see the prospect of getting something that would Article 5 that would ever be accepted by Ukrainians who would face the prospect of new Russian aggression without that kind of security guarantee, with memories still fresh of what happened memorandum and the like. So that would be one question is there any prospect that the Ukrainians would go along with what I see as an inadequate prospect that basically neutrality would mean something well short of Article 5 type commitments, whether that means NATO membership or quasi-NATO membership. And so that a second question would be going back to what you mentioned about the Cold War period, is that there was always this sense that if neutral countries came under attack, belligerent countries wanted to move troops into them or through them, that they would take action against that. Obviously, Ukraine over the last 3 years has been doing that, trying to ward off aggression. Yet no country has come to Ukraine's direct aid. There have been extensive supplies of weapons, some intelligence. No one is actually sending troops to defend Ukraine. Is there the prospect that that somehow, again, short of having countries commit to come Ukraine's defense in the event of new aggression, that there would be at least some countries that would consider it, especially in light of what seems to be the uncertain U.S. commitments under the current administration? It's still, there are so many contradictory signals coming out of Washington that it's not clear what the administration would do. But given the pro Kremlin or pro-Putin orientation of the Trump administration, is there any prospect that there would be a commitment of U.S.? That also leads me to a third question, which was raised by David Goldberg, who on the Q&A, who asks if European countries, say Great Britain or France or Poland, committed troops to be stationed in Ukraine under some peace deal, if they did not come in under NATO's auspices, do you think that would be seen by Moscow as more acceptable? Not that, again, my own view is that what Moscow thinks of it is all part of what should go into an acceptable agreement, but it certainly has to play some role if it's going to be a formal agreement. And that leads me to one final question in preliminary here, Wolfgang, which would be, is there a prospect that it will be short of a formal agreement? That is, even though the armistice in the Korean War, at least the ceasefire was signed at Panmunjom in July 1953. There was never a formal peace treaty, never a final agreement, and the two countries, Korea and North Korea, still formally at war, even though there has been now a 72-year ceasefire and armistice. Is there the process kind of settlement with regard to Russia and Ukraine that could prove as durable, given that, again, it is a highly unequal relationship? Russia is much larger, has the strategic depth that Ukraine doesn't. It has a larger army. It has a greater willingness to use troops as cannon fodder, and the like. So is there the prospect that an informal agreement without Ukrainian neutrality, that is something that have Ukraine increasingly oriented to a NATO, maybe even a formal member of NATO, but without needing Russia's consent. So that is a formal treaty. So let me, you can address any of these now, or if you want, I will take other questions and then you can come back and deal with whatever you would like.
Thank you very much. These are obviously great questions, and well, they are, I believe, some of them are beyond what anyone can answer at the moment. Let me start with or in opposite direction. Is there any prospect that some regulation may come out of this that is short of a formal agreement. I believe this is very likely. I'm no expert of U.S. foreign policy or of Donald Trump's foreign policy, but when we look at his record from the first administration, we see that first he goes in some talks with dictators somewhere, and he even seems to like them and to establish some personal bonds. But this at some point he simply loses interest, and it remains to be seen whether Russia is interested in coming to a formal agreement right now. I mean, when we see what happened over the past 48 hours or 24 hours, then we see that there is no sign at all. I mean, it would have been natural to say, at least for the time being, on the day when US and Russian delegations are meeting and discussing, among other things, Ukraine for the first time since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, it would be natural to at least stop the larger attacks or stop sending drones. But this did not occur. So I believe that there is some likelihood that something will come out that will be a frozen conflict or some a weak armistice, and then the future outcome depends on the security guarantees of Ukraine. And this is going to be, I believe, the mantra to for all the three questions. So the outcome will depend upon how reliable are the guarantees for Ukraine. With regard to the third question, we have already seen, and that you also saw it from the news, that there is British and French commitment. I also wouldn't overstate German reluctance. We have to keep in mind that there will be general elections on the next weekend. So it's understandable that Olaf Scholz did not want to make a commitment just a few days before people going to the polls. In order not to perhaps lose some points in the elections. Uh, there are commitments not only from the British and also from the French. However, there are two main obstacles. First is with regard to a more durable construction of deterrence. The British and the French obviously are lacking the nuclear component. I mean, they have their nuclear forces, but they are about taking together about 10% of either the Russian or the US arsenals, so they are certainly no match. What is already being debated is how this is going to affect the investment into the nuclear forces in European countries, in France in particular. The second caveat with regard to British and French commitment to sending troops as part of a peacekeeping force that needs to be robust, that need to be minimum 150,000. That's what our military experts tell us, and I believe they know this pretty well. Is that already right after the conversations in Riyadh stopped today? I believe it was the Russian deputy foreign minister who said that Russia would not accept any European troops as part of a peacekeeping force or of a settlement. I don't know whether this can be taken seriously at this point in time, but certainly it is not would not stress that there is really great Russian interest in coming to a peaceful settlement. Second question, obviously, no one has been sending troops to Ukraine. I believe anyone who is interested in the history of the international system of Europe over more than only the Cold War, but also into the past for 200 and 300 years, would come to the conclusion that the fact that no one has come to Ukraine's help with troops on the ground or even with their air force, this is a consequence simply of the nuclear age. No one wants to fight a nuclear power and thereby risk a nuclear attack. And otherwise, whenever you look at the history of European wartime coalitions, and it was such a preponderance of power and such a great power waging such an aggressive war and overstepping the limits of what was and what is now, or what was then perceived as being international law, then there would have formed a natural coalition intervening. But as a consequence of the nuclear age, this is not the case. Now, to the first question, would Ukraine be uh, at some point compelled to accept uh, a solution not including adequate security guarantees, or would Russia somehow accept some security guarantees? Well, again, this remains to be seen. Certainly, Russia here has the broader spectrum of different options. Uh, we see from the armistice negotiations of 22 how far both sides were ready to go back then. Uh, Ukraine was ready to give up NATO membership under condition that there were reliable security guarantees. When we see what the Russian response to security guarantees were back then it's again creating doubt whether there is a sincere Russian interest in coming to a reliable settlement, a peaceful situation. A positive signal from the Kremlin, however, certainly is the positive response to possible EU membership. Ukrainian EU membership. I believe this is a positive signal, and perhaps this can be developed into something different. Uh, Last point in this regard, a security guarantee. Of course, the strongest one would have been NATO. However, there also can be other multilateral constructions. However, if it does not include the US, certainly it will be significantly weakened. And if it includes a significant number of NATO members, then also the relation between this specific multilateral security agreement for Ukraine and NATO mutual security guarantees and obligations needs to be regulated legally, which may be a tricky point, but this can be addressed, I believe.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. So let me turn to the next question, which is with regard to in Europe that are still neutral, that is Switzerland, Austria, Ireland. How do you see their views about the desirability or lack thereof of neutrality for Ukraine?
We have seen a quite strong uh, argument or a narrative that was promoted by some colleagues here, for instance, in Austria, uh, advocating the neutrality or neutralization of Ukraine. However, at the same time, entirely forgetting that, as I have pointed out, uh, that Ukraine was a non-aligned country in 2014 when it was first attacked by Russia, and then that also neutrality does not address the security needs of Ukraine, which is the weaker. I mean, when you look at Russia and Ukraine, it's clear that Ukraine is here the weaker side, with Russia being the largest nuclear weapons country on earth, and a larger national economy, larger population. So that's quite clear. And so this narrative usually is looking at Russian security interests and thereby uh, entirely forgetting about Ukrainian security needs. But this was a part of the debate. I still remember how when one colleague here organized a talk in late 2021 with the title of the US, NATO, and Ukraine crisis. And I asked him, well, what about Russia? Is this not part? And he said, well, that would make the title too long. So you see that this sometimes is turning a blind eye on one side and not looking at this entirely comprehensively. So forgetting about the security interests of other countries than Russia.
How do you look on the changing political orientation of various parties, especially in neutral Europe, but also more generally, that you have this phenomenon in which the Kremlin has tried to attract allegiance among both far left and far right parties. For that, because it certainly was not the case during the Cold War, that the Soviet Union wasn't looking to far right parties in neutral countries. It was looking certainly to far left parties, but having only limited success in that regard. So what has changed? Is it the ending of the Cold War, or is there some other dynamic at work that allows, obviously the Russian government nowadays is not left-wing the way the Soviet government. Maybe it is this projection of a reactionary sort of what Putin calls traditionalist agenda allows the Kremlin to be able to make inroads into far right parties, but it also has been supporting far left. So is it just the opportunities that have arisen after the Cold War, or is there some other dynamic?
To be sure, there were some, although not very significant, attempts also made by the Soviet side, even in Stalin's time, and you know this much better than most other people do, at supporting right-wing groups as long as they were either pro-Soviet or pro-neutralist. We see this in Germany with the neutralist movement, and here, for instance, Peter Augenthaler has done a lot of research also with regard to the Stalin note and also the inclusion of not only a centrist neutralist groups, but also right-wing neutralist groups. And also we see it in Austria, where there is a far-right party promoted in the Soviet zone of occupation, and that was also created as a new party for former Nazis and for former Wehrmacht officers or soldiers or SS people, to bring them into a pro-Soviet direction. So as long as they were either pro-Kremlin or neutralist, they could be Nazis or far right. It didn't matter. Not even in Stalin's time. This, however, also was rather a side phenomenon. Now, turning to the post-Cold War era, I believe very much that it has something to do with opportunity. Uh, Anton Shekhovtsov, a colleague of mine here also at the University of Vienna, who wrote this a great book about Russia and the Western far right. It was published about 6 years ago. He makes the argument that it is addressing the left-wing and right-wing parties after Vladimir Putin's conservative turn in 2011, 2012. This was perhaps only the second choice. The first choice would have been addressing the stronger parties in the middle, forging bonds with conservative parties and social democratic parties, and only after being not so successful, they also turned to the right wing and then also left wing. We see this happening already since 2007, 2008, for instance. And here I can speak mostly for Austria, as we don't see this in Ireland and or on the British Isles. I mean, besides Nigel Farage, for instance, there is basically no pro-Russian discourse, and we also don't see it that much in Switzerland. I mean, there are some people who are promoting this ultra-neutralist pro-Russian discourse also in the Swiss discourse. We see this very much. Even there are some international relations experts who made themselves um, uh, uh, yeah, promoters of this cause. But perhaps this is strongest here in Austria with the Freedom Party. In Switzerland, a little also affecting, for instance, the People's Party Blocher. So this is also to be found here. I believe that the package, the ideological and political package that was offered from this Kremlin left-wing and right-wing coalition is anti-Westernism. It's the liberal West is the enemy. And on the right wing, it's liberalism, mostly with regard to migration that is attacked or that's criticized, while on the left wing, it's the European Union as a space of transnational corporations or economically liberal union. And so anti-liberalism, anti-Westernism certainly is the idea that unites this otherwise rather diverse and yeah, a rather diverse coalition.
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang. Another question has been submitted by the audience is the question about the diversity of public opinion in the Eurobarometer polling that you referred to and that is done fairly regularly during the war. The questioner says the autumn 2024 data show that in the largest EU economies, Germany, France, Italy, and also it would include non-EU country, Great Britain, public opinion support for financing of equipment to Ukraine, provision and financing of military equipment to Ukraine has not decreased. What would explain the persistence of support there as compared to some other EU countries, whereas the chart you showed, it has clearly gone down quite significantly?
I believe that this it can be explained, at least in part, by the different narratives that are around, and also by the narratives that are promoted by the strongest parties, the strongest forces, and also the strongest group in society. Also, by this, it can be explained by the structure of the media landscape in the particular countries. With regard to Germany, I believe it's clear that uh, most most significant political forces are supportive of Ukraine and also of the various measures that are taken in support of Ukraine, also including the shipment of arms, but also financial support, also accepting Ukraine as a EU candidate for membership. So these were the things that were asked in this poll. With regard to France, the situation certainly is much more diverse, also taking into account the elections that have already happened after or since the large-scale invasion started, and they certainly have shown that the liberal center and taken together with conservative, that they have certainly lost in support with regard to the right wing and left wing parties and also discourses. So for me, these French polls are also a bit surprising, and here I would have to look into the details. What is clear, however, is that all or yeah, one might even say all, or at least the most important, Western European societies have a much stronger and much more consolidated structure of communication, also of media communication, than the Central European countries have. Where social media is much stronger, much more influential, where people are relying less on conventional media, on classical media, but much more on social media, and that's certainly much more affected by campaigns. For instance, I was on a panel at the Austrian Diplomatic Academy uh, yeah, it's already 2 years ago, together with the uh, previous Slovak Prime Minister, and he was reporting from the Slovak election campaign, and he said he has never seen such a thing that social media would play such a role, and that's also something that we see in Hungary increasingly, perhaps also in the Czech Republic. Why is this significant? Also, I mean, the Central European countries are quite small and not that important. However, it's significant or important in two ways. First, because countries like Slovakia, it's a very small country, even smaller than Austria, small national economy, but it was crucial in the first month of Ukrainian defense against the Russian large-scale invasion, because it shipped many still Soviet era weapons to Ukraine. And this has been discontinued after and even before the elections in Slovakia that brought to government the left-wing populist government of Robert Fico, which is quite pro-Kremlin, and it also has discontinued support for Ukraine on a bilateral basis with regard to arms deliveries. Secondly, it's important because the more countries, the more European countries you have with a pro-Kremlin government, the more unstable the consensus within the European Union for supporting Ukraine is going to be. This is an issue that needs to adopted unanimously by all heads of state or heads of government. So this is something that needs unanimity, and that's why this is an important thing that we need to watch how many rather pro-Kremlin heads of government there are even in these smaller countries. Hitherto, neither Viktor Orban nor Robert Fico vetoed measures in support of Ukraine uh, forever. But for instance, Viktor Orban has been able to delay some things or even to shape some of the sanctions packages.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Wolfgang. Austria has only a small army, and took the stance of armed neutrality that Sweden did prior to its entry into NATO, and that Switzerland still does. Is that sentiment changing in Austria in light of Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, or which is there concern about the prospect of a direct threat to Austria itself, as well as countries that are closer to Russia, the Baltic states, Poland, and the like? Is there a debate in Austria nowadays about those sorts of issues?
Yes, most certainly, and that's the first time I ever remember that there was such a serious debate, and even measures have been adopted. So, political commitment for national defense, not only for defending Austria as being attacked directly, which no one believes is going to happen in a conventional military way, but also as a contribution to general security. This has increased dramatically since February 22. So we see these statements. We also see that investment packages have been passed the Austrian Parliament. They are suddenly much smaller. Not even 10% of what was adopted in Germany. However, the rhetoric is there, the commitment is there, and also the first steps are going into the right direction. We also have this debate um, about Austria joining this European Safe Skies initiative, so defending skies together against new challenges, against new threats like drone war, and buying this all together. This is still no alliance, so it's not defending one another. So it's perfectly possible for Austria, even as a neutral country. However, there was a very ardent debate about this between, for instance, the Conservative Party, which was a promoter and very strongly advocated Austria joining this uh, joint program for safe skies, while the right-wing Freedom Party wanted to opt out. And apparently, this was among the reasons why the second phase of the coalition negotiations, the first between the conservatives and social democrats and liberals, had come to a very sudden end in January with no conclusion. Then the conservatives and the Freedom Party continued, and this also came to a conclusion last week. While I was still in the U.S., and apparently this was over the issue of defense commitment and also doing this collectively. The second issue here is defense against hybrid challenges and threats. And here, however, the Austrian strategy still is very much cautious than other countries. While, for instance, German intelligence and German authorities make public cyber attacks against whatever happens, whether it's against German business or whether it's against German media, whether it's against German authorities like Parliament, like the headquarters of the Social Democratic Party. While they publicize it, they very rarely do so in Austria. And there was also a very interesting phenomenon happening in this case. I was referring in my talk briefly to cyber attacks on the eve of the Austrian general elections last fall. And this was publicized by a few media only. And some of them also then became targets of a huge trolling wave. And it was clear that this was trolling as it started right in the middle of the night and right after these articles have gone online. So it was clear that this was no social thing that was happening. There were no people involved in this country. Since the media also is very, by and large, used by elderly people who very rarely start to comment on the online version at 1 o'clock in the morning. So it was clear that there was a wave of trolling. But the general strategy of Austria, at least until today, is to talk very little about it. And certainly it's a difficult issue. You don't want to publicize it more than necessary. At the same time, you have to create awareness. And awareness is, in this regard, is still what's lacking here in this country.
Okay, very good. Thank you. There is a fairly long question from Nadia Boyajieva. And she, first of all, thanks you very much for your interesting analysis of Soviet strategy toward neutral countries during the Cold War and the implications for the post-Cold War period. She says, the term neutrality, as you mentioned, Western countries during the Cold War and among Soviet legal scholars and political officials. You mentioned that part of Soviet strategy toward neutrals was to require economic distance between the two camps, that is, ruling out, say, membership for neutral countries in the European Economic Community, with the exception of Ireland. I'll leave that out. But and to condemn any different behavior from neutral countries. What sort of measures did the Soviet Union take to try to ward off such behavior and to and punish neutral countries, or at least to threaten neutral countries if they exceeded what the Soviet Union saw as permissible? And does that imply for possible measures today with regard to the Russian Federation and Ukraine? So I'll let you deal with that, Wolfgang, and then I'll come back to the rest of the question. Somebody that I can't hear. Wolfgang, you're
I'm muted. I know this. Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much. Great question, Nadia, and it's great to have you here. It's I would have loved to see you all again. Now, physically, it was not possible, and now we do this online. So how did the Soviet Union punish neutrals if they did not behave that way? I believe that. Austria, to begin with, was among the rather lucky ones, because here the punishment very much a was in rhetoric and in propaganda. It was criticizing what the Austrians did. It was publishing unfriendly Pravda or Izvestia commentaries, or I showed you this nice picture of Nikita Khrushchev and Julius Raab, where Khrushchev is smiling, but all of us know that he certainly could become very angry. And we also know his statement about neutrals, rather to, I believe it was already rather to the end of his time in power, when he was saying, well, the Western neutrals, they call themselves neutral, but we already know that they rather like the US, and that they are friends of the Americans. That's how he would put it in his way. Now, when we turn to other neutral countries like Finland, that was much more exposed to Soviet pressure, then we see that the spectrum, uh, or if you wish, the variety of tools was much larger, including the withdrawal of Soviet recognition of neutrality at all. We see this in the Brezhnev era, when there is no explicit reference to Finnish neutrality, but rather to Finland aspiring to become neutral and all these kind of things. So it was a clear downgrading, again in rhetoric. Then we also see in the various crises that were created in Soviet-Finnish relations after the 1940s, the night frost crisis, and all these kind of things. We see how the Soviet side threatened to have consultations with Finland, according to the bilateral friendship treaty. So that was also clearly a sign to the Finnish that they needed to be cautious. And we also see how bilateral relations between the USSR and Finland, and also economic exchange, was at least temporarily frozen. So there was a much greater scale applied toward Finland, for instance, than toward Austria, but it was certainly, it was an arsenal that was there.
Okay, very good. I will combine the rest of Nadia's question with a question from Andrea Harris, and then unfortunately we're running out of time, so this will be the final question, Wolfgang. How in Austria, how is the particularly a country now that has been formally neutral for 70 years, how is the shift in policy perceived? For example, is there this no, is there a perception that the United States, at least under the current administration, is shifting something that seems to be oriented toward Moscow, or at least much more accommodating of Moscow? And how does that affect the view in Austria of neutrality? And let me add to this is this, and this will bring in Nadia's question as well. What is the current, not only in Austria, but more generally, how is neutrality in international politics perceived at a time when, again, the United States is moving toward or seems to be, and there are a lot of contradictory signals, but seems to be moving toward a policy that is much more accommodating of uh, the current Russian government than most and NATO European countries seem comfortable with. Is there a different perception in neutral countries, and not only in Europe, but also in the non-aligned movement countries? And as I mentioned, this is the final question. So anything you would like to say is welcome.
Yeah, great questions again. With regard to the non-aligned countries, really to make this global, I'm unfortunately lacking the data at the moment. I didn't look whether there are even polls with regard to this, but I believe that very much like during the Cold War, the non-aligned countries of the global South rather want to stay out and stay where they are. They want to follow their own interests, and they join, for instance, in the United Nations when there is something that needs to be declared, like in 2022. They certainly joined the Western initiative of calling upon Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, to stop aggression. There were plenty of non-aligned countries of the global South also supporting these resolutions, the non-binding resolutions in the General Assembly. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been such a huge super majority, if you wish, of 141 or 143 countries. However, besides that, and we have seen this also in their trade relations and also in other aspects, think about what was happening in Africa, northwestern Africa over the past uh, 2, 3, up to 5 years, then we see they certainly won't or don't want to become a part of a Western combination. So what's the place for neutrality in the future on the European continent? I believe unless the European Union and well, unless the European Union is falling apart, then I believe that neutrality will remain a minority program. As I already indicated on my first slide, so it's now only 2 or 3 are left of the previously 10 neutrals. And now this is certainly a tendency that won't be reversed very quickly. With regard to neutral perceptions of what's going on in world politics, uh, on the other side of the Atlantic, so with regard to the US position, this certainly is creating concern among Atlanticists and among those who understand what or how important the United States used to be for European security since World War II. There are certainly people who rejoice or would rejoice if the US would withdraw uh, from uh, from the European continent. However, I believe that in most countries, the majority is, if not understanding already, then it's very soon becoming to understand that this is something that Europe is of great concern for European security, and I cannot rely here on specific polls with regard to the recent most developments, but this is the picture how I see it developing over the past 2 years.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for a very stimulating seminar. And also thank you to the audience, the questioners, to my colleagues at the Davis Center at Harvard who coordinated of the seminar, Laura Sargent and others. So with that, I will end today's seminar and will again express my Wolfgang Mueller. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mark, Professor Mark Kramer. Thanks to the staff at the Davis Center, and thanks to all of you for joining the seminar and for the stimulating questions.